In the unforgiving landscape of 1880s Arizona territory, where survival depended on trust between man and beast, losing your horse meant facing death. But when seasoned cowboy Jake Matthews woke to find his prized stallion Thunder missing from a secure corral, he never imagined the mystery would lead him into the heart of Apache territory and change everything he believed about enemies and allies. What happened that night would challenge the very foundations of frontier justice and prove that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships are forged in the crucible of the American West. The morning Thunder returned carrying an Apache woman would be just the beginning of a story that would echo through the canyons for generations to come. Jake Matthews had always been a light sleeper, a necessity when working cattle drives through hostile territory. The sound that woke him wasn't unusual in itself. Horses moving around in the corral was normal. What made his blood run cold was the complete silence that followed. No snorting, no shuffling hooves, no familiar nickering that Thunder always made when sensing his master nearby. The pre-dawn air bit at his skin as Jake rolled out of his bedroll and reached for his boots. The other cowboys around the dying campfire remained deep in sleep, exhausted from yesterday's grueling push through the rocky terrain of central Arizona. Jake had volunteered for the early watch, knowing his restless nature would have him awake anyway. Now he wished he had stayed closer to the horse corral. Thunder had been with Jake for 7 years, since the horse was just a wild Mustang caught during a roundup near the Gila River. The black stallion had fought like a demon at first, refusing bridle and saddle with a fury that earned the respect of every cowhand on the ranch. But Jake had seen something special in those dark eyes, intelligence, loyalty, and a spirit that matched his own. It took months of patient work, but eventually Thunder became not just Jake's mount, but his closest companion on the lonely trails of the Southwest. The corral stood empty except for the other horses, who milled about nervously in the growing light. Jake's heart sank as he counted heads twice, then a third time. Thunder was definitely gone. The rope gate hung open, though Jake clearly remembered securing it the night before. His experienced eye immediately began reading the ground around the corral, looking for signs that would tell the story of what happened. The dirt around the gate showed clear boot prints, not the worn soles of cowboy boots, but the soft-soled moccasins favored by Apache warriors. Jake's stomach tightened. The prints were recent, probably made within the last few hours while the camp slept. Whoever had taken Thunder knew horses well enough to open the gate without spoiling the other animals and keep them calm enough not to raise an alarm. Following the tracks away from camp, Jake noticed something that puzzled him. The moccasin prints showed someone walking, not running. Thunder's hoof prints alongside showed a calm walking pace, not the frantic gallop of a stolen horse being driven away quickly. Most stolen horses were run hard and fast to put distance between the thieves and any pursuit. But these tracks suggested something different entirely. Jake had dealt with Apache horse thieves before during his years working ranches throughout Arizona territory. Usually they struck fast and hard, taking several horses at once and driving them at breakneck speed toward the mountains where pursuit would be nearly impossible. This theft felt different, more deliberate, and careful. Someone had specifically chosen Thunder over the other horses in the corral, including a valuable roan mare that any horse thief would recognize as prime stock. The trail led northeast, toward the Superstition Mountains, where Apache bands had been seen recently according to reports from passing travelers. Jake knew that pursuing alone would be foolish, but waiting for help might mean losing Thunder's trail entirely. The rocky ground ahead would make tracking increasingly difficult as the day wore on, and wind began to scatter the subtle signs that showed a horse's passage. Back at camp, Jake roused Chuck Morrison, the trail boss for their cattle drive. Chuck was a veteran of 20 years on the frontier, with gray hair and scars that testified to his experience with everything from stampedes to Indian raids. He listened grimly as Jake described the theft and the unusual circumstances. "Could be a trap," Chuck said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Apaches sometimes use horse stealing to draw men away from the main group, where they can be picked off one by one. But taking just one horse doesn't fit their usual pattern either." The other cowboys gathered around as word spread through the camp. Most urged Jake to let Thunder go and count himself lucky that the Apache had only taken one horse instead of the entire remuda. Horses could be replaced, they argued, but a man's life couldn't. The territory was full of stories about cowboys who rode off chasing horse thieves and were never seen again. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was different from the typical horse raid. The careful way Thunder had been led away, the deliberate choice of one specific horse, and the direction of travel all suggested something beyond simple theft. In 7 years together, Thunder had never willingly followed a stranger. The stallion was notoriously difficult for anyone except Jake to handle, often becoming aggressive when approached by unfamiliar people. Against the advice of his fellow cowboys, Jake decided to follow Thunder's trail. He took his second-best horse, a reliable bay gelding named Dusty, along with his rifle, pistol, and enough supplies for 3 days. Chuck tried once more to dissuade him, pointing out that the cattle drive couldn't wait while one man chased after a stolen horse, no matter how valuable. "That horse has saved my life more times than I can count," Jake told the gathered men. "I'm not abandoning him to Apache horse thieves without a fight. You boys push the herd on to Tucson. I'll catch up when I can." The trail led steadily upward into increasingly rough country as Jake followed Thunder's tracks through the morning hours. The terrain shifted from desert floor to rocky hillsides covered with scrub brush and scattered boulders. Several times he lost the trail entirely on patches of bare rock, only to pick it up again where softer ground showed hoof prints and the occasional moccasin track. As the sun climbed higher, Jake began to notice other details that added to the mystery. At one point, the track showed that horse and rider had stopped beside a small spring where Thunder had been allowed to drink leisurely. The moccasin prints showed someone who had knelt beside the spring, apparently taking time to wash and drink as well. This wasn't the behavior of someone fleeing with a stolen horse. More puzzling still, Jake found places where the tracks showed Thunder had been given free rein to choose his own path around obstacles, rather than being forced along a predetermined route. The horse had selected the easiest passages through the rocky terrain, suggesting his rider was allowing him to navigate naturally rather than forcing him toward a specific destination. By midday, Jake was deep in the foothills of the Superstition Mountains, following a faint game trail that wound between towering red rock formations. The silence was complete except for the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. This was Apache country, and Jake knew he was being watched even though he couldn't see any signs of human presence. The trail led to a narrow canyon where water trickled down the rock face to form a small pool surrounded by green vegetation. It was the kind of hidden oasis that Apache bands used as temporary camps, offering water, shelter, and concealment from enemies. Jake approached carefully, knowing that anyone waiting in the rocks above could easily pick him off without warning. Thunder's tracks led directly to the water's edge, then disappeared on the rocky ground beyond the pool. Jake dismounted and examined the area carefully, finding scattered ashes from a small fire that had been carefully extinguished. Someone had camped here recently, probably within the last few hours. But There were no signs of Thunder or his mysterious rider. Standing in the silence of the hidden canyon, Jake realized he was completely lost. The trail had vanished, and he had no idea which direction his stolen horse might have gone. The rocky walls around him seemed to close in, reminding him how far he was from help and how easily he could disappear without a trace in this vast wilderness. As he prepared to backtrack and try to pick up the trail again, Jake heard something that made his blood freeze, the unmistakable sound of unshod hooves on rock, coming from somewhere above him in the canyon. Someone was approaching, and from the deliberate pace, they weren't trying to hide their presence. Jake quickly led Dusty behind a large boulder and drew his rifle, preparing for whatever was about to emerge from the shadows of the canyon walls. The hoofbeats grew closer, echoing off the red rock walls in a rhythm that seemed strangely familiar. Jake peered around the boulder and felt his heart nearly stop. Thunder was picking his way carefully down a narrow trail from the canyon rim, his black coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. But the figure on his back wasn't the Apache warrior Jake had expected. Instead, a young Apache woman sat easily on Thunder's back, riding without saddle or bridle as if she had been born to it. Her long black hair flowed freely, and she wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. What shocked Jake most was the complete calm between horse and rider. Thunder moved with the easy grace of a horse completely at peace with his passenger, showing none of the skittishness he usually displayed around strangers. The woman saw Jake immediately, but showed no fear or surprise, as if she had been expecting to find him there. She spoke softly to Thunder, who stopped at the water's edge and lowered his head to drink. Then she slid down from his back with fluid grace and walked toward Jake, her hands held away from her body to show she carried no weapons. Jake kept his rifle ready, but didn't raise it to his shoulder. Something about the situation felt wrong for an ambush or attack. The woman moved with confident purpose, and Thunder remained calm and relaxed, showing none of the agitation he would display if his rider meant harm to his master. When she was close enough to speak without shouting, the woman stopped and looked directly into Jake's eyes. Her English, when she spoke, was clear and precise, though heavily accented. "You are the one called Jake Matthews," she said. "It wasn't a question. I am Iana, daughter of Cochise's war chief Nate. Your horse came to our camp last night, but you would not stay. He searched for you with the heart of a lost brother. I have brought him back because the spirits told me this meeting was meant to be." Jake stared at the Apache woman in complete bewilderment, his rifle still held ready, but no longer aimed in her direction. Thunder had come to their camp willingly? The idea seemed impossible, yet the evidence stood before him. The stallion showed no signs of rough handling or forced restraint, and his coat gleamed with the careful grooming that indicated gentle treatment. Iana seemed to understand his confusion and moved slowly toward Thunder, running her hand along his neck in a gesture that clearly showed familiarity. The horse responded by nuzzling her shoulder, displaying the kind of affection he typically reserved only for Jake. It was a sight that shook Jake's understanding of everything he thought he knew about his horse's nature. "Your Thunder has the spirit of a wild Mustang still strong within him," Iana continued, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed to calm both horse and man. "Last night, when the moon was high, he came to the edge of our camp. My father's warriors wanted to take him, thinking he was a gift from the spirits. But Thunder would not be taken. He came freely, but he would not stay. He called out through the night, searching for something he had lost." Jake slowly lowered his rifle, though he kept it ready at his side. The woman's story matched what he had observed in the tracks. The careful, unhurried movement away from the camp, the stops for water and rest. But it raised more questions than it answered. If he came to you willingly, why didn't he stay? Jake asked, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. And why would you bring him back to me? Ayana smiled, and Jake was struck by how the expression transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. Her dark eyes held depth and intelligence that reminded him of Thunder's own gaze when the horse was considering a difficult situation. Because Thunder's heart belongs to you, Jake Matthews. The spirits showed me this in my dreams before dawn. I saw a black horse running free across endless grasslands, but always returning to one man. The bond between you is stronger than any rope or fence. To keep Thunder from you would be like trying to stop a river from flowing to the sea. Jake found himself studying Ayana more carefully, noting details that his initial shock had caused him to miss. Her clothing, while traditionally Apache, showed recent repairs and patches that suggested life on the move rather than in a settled village. Her hands, though graceful, showed the calluses and small scars that came from hard work and difficult living. This wasn't a pampered chief's daughter, but a woman accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life. Your people and mine aren't exactly on friendly terms, Jake said carefully, still unsure whether this encounter was genuine or some elaborate trap. Why would you risk coming here alone to return a horse to a white cowboy? The question seemed to sadden Ayana, and she looked away toward the canyon walls where shadows were beginning to lengthen as the day advanced. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of experiences far beyond her apparent years. Because not all encounters between our peoples must end in bloodshed, she said quietly. My father leads warriors who fight to protect our homeland, but I have seen enough death to know that hatred only breeds more hatred. Sometimes, showing kindness to an enemy can plant seeds of understanding that might grow into something better. Jake found himself wanting to believe her, but years of frontier life had taught him caution. Apache raids had cost the lives of friends and fellow cowboys, and the territorial conflicts between settlers and native tribes had created an atmosphere of constant tension and mistrust. Yet something in Ayana's manner suggested genuine sincerity rather than deception. Thunder, meanwhile, had finished drinking and wandered over to nuzzle Jake's shoulder in his familiar greeting. The horse showed no signs of stress or mistreatment, and his affectionate behavior toward both Jake and Ayana seemed to validate her story about their peaceful encounter. "What did you know my name?" Jake asked, running his hand through Thunder's mane and checking automatically for any signs of injury or rough handling. "Your reputation reaches far beyond your own people," Ayana replied. "The Apache know of Jake Matthews, the cowboy who speaks fairly to all men and whose horse runs like the wind itself. Some of our scouts have watched you from a distance during your cattle drives. They say you treat your horses with respect and never use the whip when patience will serve better." This revelation unsettled Jake almost as much as finding Thunder missing had done. The idea that Apache warriors had been observing him without his knowledge was both frightening and strangely flattering. It meant he had survived in their territory partly because they had chosen to let him pass unmolested. "If your people know so much about me, then you also know I'm not traveling alone," Jake said, testing whether Ayana was aware of the cattle drive and the other cowboys. "My friend will be wondering where I am." "Yes, the cattle drive to Tucson with Chuck Morrison as trail boss," Ayana confirmed, showing knowledge that proved Apache intelligence about settler movements was far more extensive than most whites realized. "They will continue without you. as planned. Chuck Morrison is wise enough to know that staying in one place too long in Apache country is dangerous for everyone. The casual way she mentioned specific details about his companions and their destination made Jake realize how vulnerable all white travelers were in this territory. If the Apache chose to attack a cattle drive or wagon train, they would do so with complete knowledge of their target's numbers, weapons, and probable routes. You seem to know a great deal about white settlements and movements, Jake observed. That suggests your people are planning something more than just random raids. Ayana's expression became guarded, and Jake realized he had touched on information she wasn't prepared to share. The momentary tension reminded him that despite her apparent friendliness, she was still a member of a tribe currently at war with his own people. I know what any daughter of a war chief must know to help her people survive, she said carefully. But I did not come here to discuss war or politics. I came to return Thunder to his rightful companion and to honor the message the spirits gave me in my dreams. The mention of spiritual guidance didn't surprise Jake, as he knew Apache culture placed great emphasis on dreams and visions as sources of direction and wisdom. But it raised questions about why the spirits would direct an Apache woman to help a white cowboy, especially during a time of active conflict between their peoples. What exactly did these spirits tell you? Jake asked, genuinely curious about the religious aspect of her motivation. Ayana hesitated for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision about how much to reveal. She moved to sit on a flat rock near the water's edge, and Thunder wandered over to stand protectively near her, as if sensing the emotional weight of what she was about to share. 3 nights ago, I dreamed of a great storm coming to this land, she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a storyteller. In the dream, I saw white men and Apache warriors fighting until the earth was red with blood and the rivers ran with tears of mothers and wives. But then I saw a black horse running between the armies, carrying messages of peace from one side to the other. Jake sat down across from her, drawn in despite himself by the intensity of her narration. Thunder moved to stand between them, as if symbolically bridging the gap between 2 different worlds. The horse in my dream looked exactly like Thunder, Ayana continued, and the man who rode him had your face, Jake Matthews. The spirits showed me that Thunder would come to our camp, and thou must bring him back to you. They said this meeting would begin something important, though they did not show me exactly what that would be. The story sounded fantastical to Jake's practical mind, yet he couldn't deny the accuracy of her vision regarding Thunder's visit to the Apache camp. If her dream had predicted that event correctly, perhaps there was more truth to Apache's spiritual beliefs than he had previously considered. Do you believe dreams can really predict the future? Jake asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. I believe the spirits sometimes show us glimpses of what might be if we make the right choices, Ayana replied. Dreams are not commands, but guidance, offering possibilities rather than certainties. What we do with the information determines whether the vision becomes reality or remains only a dream. As they talked, Jake found himself relaxing in Ayana's presence. Her intelligence and thoughtfulness challenged his preconceptions about Apache people, whom he had learned to think of primarily as fierce warriors rather than complex individuals with rich inner lives. The conversation was unlike any he had ever had with a woman, white or Indian, covering topics that most frontier women would have considered inappropriate. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows in the canyon, and Jake realized he needed to make a decision about what to do next. He could take Thunder and head back toward the cattle drive, trying to catch up with the herd before they reached dangerous territory. Or he could continue this unprecedented conversation with an Apache woman who claimed to have messages from the spirit world. I should be getting back, Jake said reluctantly, standing and moving toward Thunder. The longer I stay away from the herd, the more likely someone will come looking for me. That could be dangerous for both of us. Ayana nodded understanding, but made no immediate move to leave. Instead, she stood and approached Thunder, placing her hand on his neck in a gesture of farewell that the horse accepted with obvious regret. "Before you go," she said, turning to face Jake directly, "there is something else the spirits showed me that you should know. The storm I saw in my dreams is coming sooner than anyone expects. There are those among my people who believe the time has come for a final war to drive all whites from Apache land. If that war comes, many will die on both sides." The warning chilled Jake more than the cool air beginning to flow down from the canyon rim as evening approached. Apache wars were legendary for their ferocity and the devastating losses they inflicted on both sides. If Ayana's father was planning a major offensive, every white settlement and traveler in the territory would be at risk. "Are you warning me so I can alert the army?" Jake asked suspiciously, wondering if this entire encounter was designed to spread fear among the white population. "I am warning you because the spirits showed me that you might be able to help prevent the worst of what is coming," Ayana replied seriously. "But only if you choose to trust what seems impossible and act on faith rather than fear." Jake felt the weight of Ayana's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. The idea that he, a simple cowboy, might somehow play a role in preventing a war between Apache and white settlers seemed absurd. Yet the sincerity in her dark eyes and the accuracy of her previous visions made it difficult to dismiss her warnings entirely. "What exactly are you suggesting I do?" Jake asked, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. "I'm not a government official or military commander. I'm just a cowhand trying to make an honest, living, moving cattle across hostile territory. Sometimes the most important messages come through the most unlikely messengers," Ayana replied, moving to gather water from the spring in a small gourd she carried. "The spirits choose their instruments not based on power or position, but on character and willingness to act when action is needed." As she spoke, Thunder moved restlessly between them, sensing the tension in their conversation. The horse's behavior reminded Jake of how animals often seem to understand human emotions better than humans understood each other. Perhaps there was wisdom in Thunder's obvious acceptance of Ayana that Jake should pay attention to. "Tell me about this war your father is planning," Jake said, making a decision to trust her enough to gather more information. "If I'm supposed to help prevent it, I need to understand what's driving it and when it might happen." Ayana looked up at the canyon walls, as if checking for hidden listeners before responding. The caution in her movements reminded Jake that she was taking considerable risks by sharing Apache military secrets with a white man, regardless of her spiritual motivations. "My father Nate has been meeting with war chiefs from other Apache bands throughout the summer," she began quietly. "They believe the white government's promises of peace are lies designed to weaken Apache resistance, while more settlers flood into our ancestral lands. Recent attacks on Apache families by white vigilante groups have convinced many warriors that negotiation is useless." Jake winced at the mention of vigilante attacks. He had heard stories from other cowboys about groups of armed settlers who took justice into their own hands when they believed Apache raids had cost them livestock or lives. These unofficial military actions often targeted innocent Apache families, creating cycles of revenge that escalated into broader conflicts. "There was an incident 3 weeks ago near Globe," Ayana continued, her voice heavy with grief. "White miners attacked an Apache camp at dawn, killing women and children along with the warriors. Among the dead was my cousin's infant daughter, barely 6 months old. The miners claimed they were pursuing horse thieves, but the camp they attacked had been peaceful, trading legally with white merchants for months. The pain in Ayana's voice made Jake understand why Apache war chiefs might see violence as their only option. If white settlers were killing Apache babies in the name of frontier justice, any hope for peaceful coexistence was being destroyed by extremists on both sides. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jake said quietly, meaning the words despite the gulf between their peoples. "But if your father launches a war in response, more innocents will die on both sides. How would that honor your cousin's daughter's memory?" "That is exactly the argument I have made to my father," Ayana replied, meeting Jake's eyes with a gaze that held both determination and desperation. "But the war chiefs believe they must strike now before white settlements become too numerous and well-defended to defeat. They plan to attack multiple targets simultaneously, beginning with isolated ranches and mining camps, then moving against larger settlements if the initial attacks succeed." The scope of what she was describing made Jake's blood run cold. A coordinated Apache offensive could devastate the entire territory, killing hundreds of settlers and potentially triggering federal military intervention that would result in the complete destruction of Apache independence. The cycle of violence would escalate until one side or the other faced complete annihilation. "When is this supposed to begin?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "The attack is planned for the next new moon, which is 8 days away," Ayana said. "That gives little time for anyone to prevent it or warn the targets. But the spirits showed me that there might be another way if the right person carried the right message at the right time." Jake found himself pacing the small area around spring, his mind racing through possibilities and obstacles. 8 days wasn't much time to accomplish anything significant, especially when he wasn't even sure what he was supposed to accomplish. Yet the urgency in Ayana's voice convinced him that she genuinely believed he could make a difference. "What kind of message are you talking about?" Jake asked. "And who am I supposed to deliver it to?" "There's a man named Colonel Henderson at Fort McDowell who has shown respect for Apache culture and has tried to negotiate fairly in previous conflicts," Ayana explained. "Unlike many military commanders, he understands that Apache people are not savages but proud warriors defending their homeland. If anyone in the white government would listen to a proposal for genuine peace, it would be him." Jake knew of Colonel Henderson by reputation. The man was said to be one of the few Army officers who had actually studied Apache customs and language, and who treated captured Apache warriors as prisoners of war rather than criminals. But convincing him to take action based on information provided by an Apache woman through a cowboy messenger would require careful handling. "What exactly would I tell him?" Jake asked. "That I met an Apache woman in a hidden canyon who told me about a planned attack? He'd think I was either lying or crazy. You would tell him that there are Apache leaders who want peace but are being forced toward war by extremists on both sides," Ayana said. "You would propose a meeting between Colonel Henderson and my father under conditions of mutual safety to discuss terms that might prevent the coming bloodshed." The idea seemed reasonable in principle, but Jake could see numerous practical obstacles. Getting his father to agree to such a meeting would require Ayana to convince Apache war chiefs to trust white promises of safe conduct. Meanwhile, Colonel Henderson would have to believe that the meeting wasn't a trap designed to eliminate a key military leader. Even if both sides agreed to meet, what terms could possibly satisfy both Apache and white demands? Jake asked. "Your people want the whites to stop encroaching on your land, while the settlers believe they have legal rights to territory they've purchased or claimed under government programs. The spirits showed me a vision of shared use rather than exclusive ownership, Ayana replied, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone recalling a powerful dream. I saw Apache bands and white settlements coexisting in the same territory, each respecting the other's needs and rights. White farmers and ranchers using valley floors and water sources, while Apache people maintained their traditional hunting and gathering grounds in the mountains and desert regions. It was an appealing vision, but Jake knew the practical difficulties would be enormous. White settlers wanted security and legal guarantees, while Apache culture emphasized freedom of movement and resistance to external authority. Finding middle ground between such different worldviews would require unprecedented flexibility from both sides. Do you really think your father would agree to such arrangements? Jake asked skeptically. From what I've heard about Apache war chiefs, compromise isn't usually their preferred approach to problems. My father is a practical man despite his fierce reputation, Ayana said firmly. He understands that a war against the United States government can have only one outcome in the long term. The whites have too many soldiers, too many weapons, and too many settlers. Even if Apache warriors win initial battles, we cannot win a prolonged war of attrition. The admission surprised Jake with its candid assessment of military realities. He had assumed that Apache leaders believed in their ability to drive white settlers from the territory entirely. Hearing that at least some understood the futility of total war gave him hope that negotiation might be possible. If your father knows that war is ultimately hopeless, why is he planning to launch attacks anyway? Jake asked. Because he believes that dying in battle defending Apache land is preferable to living as prisoners on government reservations, Ayana explained sadly. Many of our warriors share that belief. They would rather fight and die free than survive under white control. Jake could understand that sentiment even if he couldn't fully embrace it. The Apache way of life, based on freedom of movement across vast territories, was fundamentally incompatible with a reservation system that confined tribes to specific areas under government supervision. For people who had lived independently for countless generations, such restrictions would feel like a kind of death in life. But you believe there's another alternative, Jake said, more as a statement than a question. I believe the spirits have shown me a path that could preserve Apache freedom while ending the cycle of violence, Ayana replied with quiet conviction. But that path requires trust between enemies, which may be the most difficult thing of all to achieve. Thunder had been standing quietly during their conversation, but now he moved closer to Jake and nuzzled his shoulder insistently. The horse's behavior reminded Jake that time was passing and decisions needed to be made. If he was going to reach Fort McDowell before the planned Apache attacks began, he needed to start traveling soon. Assuming I agree to try this, Jake said carefully, how would I contact you again to arrange the meeting between your father and Colonel Henderson? There's a place called Weaver's Needle, a rock formation visible from many miles away in the Superstition Mountains, Ayana explained. If Colonel Henderson agrees to meet, signal by building a fire on the highest point you can reach near the needle at sunset 7 days from now. I will be watching for the smoke and will know to bring my father to the meeting place you choose. The plan sounded workable, though Jake realized he would be taking enormous risks if he committed to it. Traveling alone to Fort McDowell would expose him to both Apache war parties and white vigilante groups who might mistake him for a threat. Then, if he succeeded in arranging the meeting, he would be responsible for ensuring that neither side used the gathering to ambush the other. What if Colonel Henderson refuses to meet? Jake asked. Or what if your father changes his mind about negotiating? Then the war will come as planned, and many people will die who might have lived, Ionis said simply. But at least we will have tried to honor the Spirit's guidance and follow the path of peace instead of violence. Standing in the gathering twilight of the hidden canyon, with Thunder waiting patiently for direction and Iona watching him with hope and desperation in her dark eyes, Jake felt the weight of a decision that could affect hundreds of lives. Everything he had been taught about Apache, people suggested that trusting them was foolish and dangerous. Yet everything about this encounter suggested that Iona was genuine in her desire for peace. I'll do it, Jake said finally, the words coming out before his rational mind could offer more objections. I'll ride to Fort McDowell and try to convince Colonel Henderson to meet with your father. But if this turns out to be some kind of trap, I'll make sure the Army knows exactly who provided the information. Relief flooded Iona's face, and for a moment she looked like the young woman she actually was rather than the wise diplomat she had been forced to become. She approached Thunder and spoke softly to him in Apache, words that Jake couldn't understand but that seemed to affect the horse deeply. Thunder nickered softly in response and nuzzled her hand gently. I have asked Thunder to carry you safely on this journey and to bring you back whole, Iona explained, stepping back from the horse. Apache people believe that horses can understand much more than they can speak. Thunder will know that this mission is important and will do everything in his power to help you succeed. As Jake prepared to mount Thunder for the ride to Fort McDowell, Iona reached into a small pouch she wore and pulled out something that made him freeze in surprise. It was a small silver medallion on a leather cord, obviously of white manufacture, but decorated with Apache beadwork. This belonged to my brother, who died fighting white soldiers 2 years ago, she said, offering it to Jake. He took it from a cavalry officer during his last battle. Wear it when you meet with Colonel Henderson as proof that you speak for Apache people who genuinely want peace. Jake stared at the medallion in Iona's outstretched hand, understanding the profound significance of what she was offering. The small piece of silver represented not just proof of Apache sincerity, but a deeply personal sacrifice. For her to give him something that had belonged to her dead brother showed a level of trust that went far beyond anything he had expected from this encounter. Are you sure about this? Jake asked, knowing he couldn't refuse the gesture without insulting both Iona and the memory of her brother. This must mean a great deal to you. It does, Iona acknowledged, her voice thick with emotion. But my brother died believing that whites and Apaches could never live in peace. If wearing his medallion helps you convince Colonel Henderson to prevent this war, then his death will finally serve the cause of peace he never lived to see. Jake accepted the medallion with reverence, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. The silver was warm from Iona's touch and reflected the last rays of sunlight filtering into the canyon. As he slipped the leather cord over his head, he noticed that the Apache beadwork incorporated symbols he didn't recognize, but that somehow felt significant. What do these symbols mean? Jake asked, examining the intricate patterns worked around the silver disc. The blue and white beads represent sky and earth coming together in harmony, Iona explained. The red beads symbolize the blood that has been shed, while the yellow ones represent the hope for a golden future where children can grow up without fear. My brother added these symbols after he became a warrior, believing they would protect him in battle. The medallion felt heavier around Jake's neck as he understood its meaning. He was carrying not just a piece of jewelry, but a prayer for peace made tangible through Apache craftsmanship and sacrifice. It would serve as a constant reminder of what was at stake in his mission to Fort McDowell. Thunder seemed eager to leave the canyon as full darkness approached, sensing perhaps that lingering in Apache territory after nightfall would be dangerous for everyone involved. Jake mounted the stallion and looked down at Ayana, who stood quietly beside the spring with moonlight beginning to illuminate her face. "How will I know if your father agrees to the meeting?" Jake asked, realizing they hadn't established a complete communication system. "If my father consents to meet with Colonel Henderson, I will place a white stone on the trail leading from Weaver's Needle toward the meeting place you choose," Ayana replied. "Look for it when you come to signal with your fire. If there is no white stone, you will know that the war chiefs have decided against negotiation." Jake nodded, committing the signal system to memory. The success of their entire plan would depend on precise communication despite the lack of direct contact between the opposing sides. Any misunderstanding could result in disaster for everyone involved. "What if something happens to you?" Jake asked, suddenly, aware that Ayana was taking enormous personal risks by defying Apache war plans and working with a white man. "If the war chiefs discover what you're doing, then I will face the consequences of following my conscience instead of tribal politics," Ayana said with quiet dignity. "Some things are worth risking everything to achieve, and preventing unnecessary bloodshed is one of them." The courage in her voice reminded Jake that he wasn't the only one putting himself in danger for the sake of peace. Ayana's position as the daughter of a war chief might offer some protection, but it wouldn't save her if tribal leaders decided she had committed treason by revealing military secrets to the enemy. As Jake prepared to leave, Thunder suddenly raised his head and looked intently toward the canyon entrance. His ears pricked forward and his muscles tensed in a way that always indicated he had detected something humans couldn't perceive. Both Jake and Ayana immediately became alert, knowing that Thunder's senses were far more acute than their own. "Someone is coming," Ayana whispered, her hand moving instinctively to a knife at her belt. "We must separate quickly before we are seen together." "Which way should I go?" Jake asked urgently, looking around the canyon for alternative exits. "Follow the creek bed downstream for half a mile, then turn west toward the main trail," Ayana directed rapidly. "I will go up the cliff face by a path only Apache feet can follow. If we are discovered, you are here alone tracking your stolen horse." Jake wanted to say something more, to somehow acknowledge the magnitude of what they were attempting together, but there was no time for extended farewells. Thunder was already moving toward the creek, responding to Jake's unconscious signals as he prepared to leave. 7 days at sunset, Ayana reminded him as she began climbing toward what looked like an impossible route up the canyon wall. "Look for the white stone and pray that wisdom prevails over anger." Jake watched her disappear into the shadows above with movements so fluid they seemed supernatural. Within moments, it was as if she had never been there at all, leaving only the memory of their conversation and the medallion around his neck as proof of their encounter. Thunder picked his way carefully down the creek bed, his hooves making minimal noise on the smooth stones worn by countless years of water flow. The ride back toward the main trail took longer than expected, as Jake had to navigate in near darkness through terrain he had never seen before. Thunder seemed to possess an innate sense of direction that kept them moving in the right general direction, but progress was slow and careful. Any mistake could result in a fall that would leave both horse and rider stranded in Apache territory. As they emerged from the creek bed and found the main trail, Jake heard voices in the distance behind them. The sounds were too far away to make out individual words, but The tone suggested urgent discussion rather than casual conversation. Someone had discovered the hidden canyon and was probably investigating signs of recent occupation. Jake urged Thunder into a faster pace, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever Apache patrol might be searching the area. The stallion responded eagerly, seeming to understand that speed and stealth were now essential for their survival. They moved through the night like shadows, following game trails and avoiding open areas where moonlight might reveal their presence to watching eyes. The journey to Fort McDowell would take 2 full days of hard riding across some of the most dangerous territory in Arizona. Jake would have to avoid known Apache strongholds while also steering clear of areas where white vigilante groups might mistake him for a threat. His safest route lay through the middle ground between settlements, following cattle trails and stage routes that offered some protection, but required careful timing. By dawn, Jake had covered nearly 20 miles from the hidden canyon, pushing Thunder harder than he normally would, but knowing that distance was their best protection. They stopped at a natural spring where Jake allowed the stallion to rest and drink while he considered his next moves. The medallion around his neck caught the morning light, reminding him constantly of the promise he had made and the lives depending on his success. Looking at his map, Jake calculated that he could reach Fort McDowell by late afternoon of the second day if he maintained a steady pace and avoided major obstacles. The fort was located at the confluence of the Verde and Salt Rivers, in an area where military patrols provided some security for civilian travelers. Once he reached the military zone, his biggest challenge would shift from avoiding Apache war parties to convincing a skeptical army officer to trust information provided by the enemy. Thunder seemed refreshed after his rest and eager to continue the journey. As they resumed traveling, Jake found himself thinking about the enormity of what Ayanna was attempting. She was essentially betraying her own people's military plans in hopes of preventing a war that could destroy Apache independence forever. The courage required for such a decision was almost beyond comprehension. Throughout the day, Jake encountered signs of increasing military activity as he approached the more settled regions of the territory. He passed 2 cavalry patrols heading in the opposite direction, toward the Apache strongholds he had just left. The soldiers looked grim and professional, clearly on serious business rather than routine reconnaissance. The second patrol was led by a young lieutenant who recognized Jake as a civilian traveler and stopped to question him about Apache activity in the region. Jake answered honestly about seeing signs of increased movement without revealing his encounter with Ayanna or the specific intelligence she had provided. "You'd best stay close to the main settlements for the next few weeks," the lieutenant advised. "We've received reports of unusual Apache gatherings in the mountains, and headquarters believes they may be planning coordinated attacks. Civilians traveling alone are taking serious risks right now." The warning confirmed what Ayanna had told him about Apache war preparations, lending credibility to her other claims about timing and targets. If Army intelligence was already detecting signs of the planned offensive, Colonel Henderson might be more receptive to information that could help prevent it. Jake thanked the lieutenant for the warning and continued toward Fort McDowell with renewed urgency. Every hour of delay reduced the chances that diplomatic intervention could succeed before violence erupted. The 8-day timeline Ayanna had mentioned was probably accurate, which meant he had less than a week to arrange a meeting that could prevent dozens or hundreds of deaths. As evening approached, Jake made camp in a grove of cottonwoods near a reliable water source, choosing a location that offered concealment while allowing quick escape routes in multiple directions. Thunder grazed peacefully while Jake prepared a simple meal and consider how to approach Colonel Henderson when they reached the fort. The challenge wasn't just convincing the colonel that Apache peace overtures were genuine, but also ensuring that any meeting between military and tribal leaders didn't become an opportunity for ambush by extremists on either side. Jake would have to propose security arrangements that satisfied both Apache concerns about treachery and Army requirements for protecting their personnel. Sitting by a small fire with Thunder standing guard nearby, Jake examined the medallion more carefully in the firelight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, combining white silversmithing techniques with traditional Apache decorative methods. It represented exactly the kind of cultural blending that might be possible if peace could be established between the competing communities. The night passed quietly, with only the normal sounds of desert wildlife to disturb Jake's rest. He woke before dawn and prepared for the final day of travel to Fort McDowell, knowing that everything depended on his ability to convince Colonel Henderson that an unprecedented opportunity for peace was worth the considerable risks involved. Thunder seemed to sense the importance of their mission, moving with unusual alertness and responding instantly to Jake's guidance. The stallion had always been intelligent, but his behavior since leaving the hidden canyon suggested an almost supernatural understanding of what was at stake. Perhaps Ayana's blessing had indeed conveyed something beyond mere words. As the sun climbed higher, Jake could see dust clouds in the distance that indicated the location of Fort McDowell. Within hours, he would be presenting the most important case of his life to a man who held the power to prevent or trigger a devastating war. Fort McDowell appeared on the horizon like a beacon of military order in the wild Arizona landscape. The sight of American flags flying over wooden buildings and organized patrol schedules filled Jake with both relief and apprehension. He had reached safety, but now came a much more difficult task of convincing a career military officer to stake his reputation on intelligence provided by Apache sources. Thunder's hooves echoed on the hard-packed ground as they approached the main gate, where two sentries stood at attention despite the blazing afternoon heat. The soldiers examined Jake with professional thoroughness, noting his travel-worn appearance and the obvious quality of his horse. One of them stepped forward as Jake dismounted. "State your business, sir," the corporal said politely but firmly. "All civilian visitors must register with the duty officer before entering the fort. I need to speak with Colonel Henderson on a matter of urgent territorial security," Jake replied, trying to sound official without being overly dramatic. "I have information about potential Apache military activity that requires immediate attention." The sentries exchanged glances that suggested they heard such claims regularly from civilian travelers who wanted to report every suspicious shadow as evidence of impending Indian attacks. However, the corporal's expression became more serious as he noticed details that marked Jake as an experienced frontiersman rather than a panicked settler. "The colonel is in conference with his staff officers," the corporal explained. "I can arrange for you to speak with Captain Morrison, who handles intelligence gathering for this district. If your information proves significant, he can arrange a meeting with the colonel." Jake realized this was probably the best he could hope for initially. Military protocol would require him to work his way up the chain of command rather than demanding immediate access to the commanding officer. He handed Thunder's reins to an orderly and followed the corporal toward the fort's administrative building. Captain Morrison proved to be a lean, weathered man in his 30s whose eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to evaluating conflicting reports from multiple sources. His office was Spartan but efficient, with maps of the territory covering most of one wall and detailed notes pinned to boards around his desk. "I understand you have information about Apache activity," Morrison said without preamble as Jake took a seat across from his desk. Before we proceed, I need to know your qualifications for providing reliable intelligence in this matter. Jake had prepared for this question during his ride to the fort, understanding that his credibility would be crucial to achieving his mission. He provided a concise summary of his 7 years working cattle drives through Apache territory, mentioning specific encounters and geographical knowledge that demonstrated his familiarity with tribal patterns and behavior. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or consulting maps when Jake referenced specific locations. When Jake finished his background summary, the captain leaned back in his chair and studied him with increased interest. "Your experience is impressive," Morrison acknowledged. "Few civilians have spent as much time in active Apache territory and lived to report on it. What specific information do you have that brought you here in such obvious haste?" This was the crucial moment when Jake would have to reveal information that could either save lives or destroy his credibility entirely. He took a deep breath and began explaining his encounter with Ayanna, carefully presenting the facts in a way that emphasized the strategic value of the intelligence while acknowledging its unusual source. Morrison's expression grew increasingly serious as Jake described the planned coordinated attack set for the next new moon. When Jake mentioned the involvement of multiple Apache bands under war chief leadership, the captain sat forward and began asking detailed questions about numbers, targets, and timing. "This information aligns with intelligence we've been gathering from other sources," Morrison admitted after Jake had answered several rounds of questions. "We've observed unusual movement patterns and communication between Apache groups that suggested they were planning something significant. Your report fills in gaps that we couldn't explain through normal reconnaissance." The validation of his information encouraged Jake to take the next step in his mission. He carefully explained Ayanna's proposal for a peace meeting, emphasizing that some Apache leaders recognized the futility of prolonged warfare and were seeking alternatives to the planned offensive. Morrison's reaction was immediately skeptical. "You're suggesting that we trust Apache claims of wanting peace negotiations based on the word of a single woman who approached you in an isolated canyon? That scenario has ambush trap written all over it." "I consider that possibility extensively," Jake replied, pulling out the medallion and placing it on Morrison's desk. "But this convinced me that her offer was genuine." Morrison examined the medallion carefully, recognizing both the military origin of the silver disc and the sophisticated Apache beadwork surrounding it. His expression showed that he understood the significance of such a personal artifact being offered as proof of sincerity. "Tell me more about this woman," Morrison said, his tone becoming more thoughtful. "What makes you believe she has the influence to speak for Apache war chiefs?" Jake described Ayanna's evident education, her knowledge of white military activities, and her position as the daughter of War Chief Nate. He emphasized her obvious intelligence and the personal risks she was taking by defying tribal plans for war. "If she's genuine, this could be the opportunity we've been hoping for," Morrison mused, studying the medallion in the lamplight. "But the risks of proceeding based on potentially false information are enormous. If this is a trap designed to eliminate Colonel Henderson, the consequences could be catastrophic. What if we could design a meeting that minimized those risks while still allowing genuine negotiation?" Jake suggested, "There must be ways to arrange contact between military and tribal leaders that provide security for both sides." Morrison stood and walked to the wall map, examining the geographical features around Fort McDowell and the known Apache strongholds in the surrounding mountains. After several minutes of silent consideration, he turned back to Jake with a thoughtful expression. "There's a possibility that might work, Morrison said slowly. But it would require Colonel Henderson to approve an extremely unconventional approach to military diplomacy. I'll need to present your information to him immediately. Jake waited anxiously while Morrison left to confer with the colonel, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether his desperate mission had any chance of success. Through the office window, he could see Thunder being cared for by the fort's stable hands, and the sight of his faithful horse reminded him of everything that had led to this crucial moment. Colonel Henderson proved to be a tall, dignified man with gray hair and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to see far more than most people revealed. His presence filled the small office when he entered with Morrison, and Jake understood immediately why this officer had earned respect from both his own men and Apache adversaries. "Captain Morrison has briefed me on your information," the colonel said, taking a seat and fixing Jake with a direct stare. "I'm prepared to consider the possibility of peace negotiations, but only if we can establish adequate security measures and reliable communication protocols." The colonel's willingness to consider the proposal surprised Jake, who had expected much more resistance from military leadership. Henderson's reputation for fairness apparently extended to genuine interest in ending conflict through negotiation rather than force. "What kind of security measures did you have in mind?" Jake asked, encouraged by the colonel's pragmatic approach. "A neutral meeting site that offers escape routes for both parties, with small escort groups rather than large military formations that might be perceived as threatening," Henderson explained. "The meeting would need to be brief and focused on establishing whether genuine negotiation is possible, rather than attempting to resolve all issues in a single encounter." Jake described Ayana's communication system using Weaver's Needle as a signal point, and Henderson nodded approval of the geographical choice. The distinctive rock formation was visible from great distances and offered multiple approach routes that would allow both sides to verify the absence of hidden forces. "If I agree to this meeting, I'll be staking my career and possibly my life on the word of an Apache woman I've never met," Henderson said bluntly. "What assurance can you give me that this isn't an elaborate trap designed to eliminate military leadership?" "None that would satisfy normal military standards," Jake admitted honestly. "But the alternative is a coordinated Apache offensive that could kill dozens of settlers and soldiers while ultimately achieving nothing except mutual destruction. If there's even a small chance that negotiation could prevent that bloodshed, isn't it worth the risk?" Henderson exchanged a long look with Captain Morrison before responding. Jake could see the internal struggle between military caution and humanitarian hope playing out in the colonel's expression. "I'll agree to the meeting, but with specific conditions," Henderson finally decided. "The Apache delegation must be limited to no more than 5 individuals, including your contact. The meeting site must allow for multiple escape routes and provide clear sight lines in all directions. And if any hostile activity is detected before or during the meeting, we withdraw immediately without negotiation." Jake felt relief flood through him as he realized that the most difficult part of his mission had been accomplished. Colonel Henderson was willing to take the enormous risk of meeting with Apache war chiefs based on information from an unlikely source. Now the success of the peace effort would depend on whether Ayana could convince her father to accept similar terms. "When do you want to signal for the meeting?" Morrison asked, consulting a calendar on Henderson's desk. "Tomorrow night at sunset," Jake replied, remembering Ayana's instructions about timing. "That will give me time to reach Weaver's Needle and build a signal fire if the Apache delegation agrees to meet." Henderson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape where his soldiers patrolled daily against Apache attacks. When he turned back to Jake, his expression showed the weight of command and the burden of making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Mr. Matthews, you've presented me with either the greatest opportunity for peace this territory has seen in years, or the most dangerous trap ever laid for American military forces, the colonel said gravely. I pray your judgment about this Apache woman proves correct, because if it doesn't, the consequences will be catastrophic for everyone involved. That evening, Jake was given quarters in the fort and invited to dine with the officers, who questioned him extensively about Apache customs, territory, and military capabilities. The conversation helped him understand how little even experienced military commanders knew about the people they were fighting, and how much of their strategy was based on assumptions rather than accurate intelligence. The next morning, Jake set out for Weaver's Needle with renewed hope, but also deepening anxiety about what he might find there. If Ayanna had been discovered and punished for her peace efforts, or if Apache war chiefs had rejected her proposal for negotiation, his signal fire would receive no response. The failure of the peace initiative would leave both sides preparing for a war that could destroy Apache independence forever. Thunder seemed to sense the importance of their mission, covering ground with steady determination despite the challenging terrain. As they climbed into the foothills of the Superstition Mountains, Jake found himself scanning every ridge and canyon for signs of Apache presence, knowing that watchers were certainly observing his approach. Weaver's Needle appeared in the distance like a giant finger pointing toward the sky, its distinctive silhouette unchanged despite all the human drama playing out in the surrounding landscape. Jake reached the formation with several hours to spare before sunset, giving him time to gather wood and prepare the signal fire that would communicate Colonel Henderson's willingness to meet. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Jake climbed to the highest accessible point near the Needle and built his fire according to Ayanna's instructions. The flames caught quickly in the dry mountain air, sending a column of smoke skyward that would be visible for miles in any direction. Standing beside his signal fire as darkness gathered around the mountains, Jake watched for any sign of response to his message. The success of everything he and Ayanna had worked toward would be revealed in the next few hours, when Apache scouts either appeared to guide him to a meeting place or failed to show themselves at all. In the distance, a coyote howled its evening song, and Jake found himself hoping that the sound carried messages of peace rather than war to anyone listening in the gathering darkness of the Arizona wilderness.